So if you just want to tell me a little bit about like what your position is and your employer and stuff like that.
Sure. So I am the archivist and curator for moving image and recorded sound collections at the Rhode Island Historical Society. So the Rhode Island Historical Society we're a statewide organization, but we are a private nonprofit. So we're not actually a state organization, although, we're not a government organization, but we, in some ways I don't want to say we act like a government organization in that we don't collect government records that would go to the state archives, but we are a statewide organization. Historical Society has been around for almost 200 years. So 2022 will be our 200th anniversary. My specific kind of domain, the moving image and recorded sound collections, for the most part are 20th century collections for one, whereas a lot of the materials within the Historical Society tend to skew much older, going back to the founding of Rhode Island, materials from, Roger Williams, up through, very contemporary stuff. And I mean, right now, one of the projects that I've been working on over the past week or so is starting to launch a born digital crowdsourced archive for the COVID-19 experience in Rhode Island. So that's something that, we're starting to work on, right? So we basically go from 1600s up through today is kind of falls within our collecting policy. And really our collecting policy is essentially just anything that pertains to the lives of the people of Rhode Island. And the organization, just to give you a little more of kind of an overview of the Historical Society itself, we're sort of a multi-part organization. So I am part of the research center, but we also have 2 museums. So it's the John Brown House Museum, so that's in Providence, and that's kind of where our education department is run out of and our programming for the most part. And then we also have the Museum of Work and Culture, which is in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. And that's a museum that is focused on kind of labor and immigration history, particularly focused on immigration to that kind of Northern Rhode Island, French Canadian immigration, but also looking at kind of wider issues of immigration and labor. And then we kind of have another building in Providence called the Aldrich House, which is where our administrative staff is and kind of executive staff are housed. So I'm in the library, I'm in the research center. There are about 7 of us, I think, right now who work in the research center. And as far as, and we're open to the public, so we have some stuff that is kind of always available to the public in our reading rooms. We're open to the public Wednesdays through Fridays and also the second Saturday of every month. And within our reading room, we do have some reference material that is sort of, always available for people to pull off the shelves themselves. And then the vast majority of our collections are upstairs in the stacks and need to be requested as special collections. In the building, in the research center where I am, we hold, so very little of our material is housed off-site. So everything that's kind of text-based, photo, moving image, and sound is housed where I am in the library, in the research center. And then everything that's like museum objects, collections related stuff is in the John Brown House. So some of that is on display, whether it's furniture or paintings or whatever. And then a lot of it is also in collection storage over there. And that could be, everything from, the furniture and things like that, but also a wedding dress, samplers, you know, cross-stitching samplers, and army uniforms, and, you know, kind of everything under the sun. So the collections are really, really vast. As far as my world and my role, so for one, my position, which is a full-time position, is new. When I started about 1.5 years ago, it was a newly created position. So the film collection was started in 1969. And as far as I know, there was kind of full-time film archive staff for about a decade, but I don't believe it's been a permanent position since the late 1970s. There was, about a decade ago, there was somebody who was doing work with the film collections under a grant-funded position for a couple of years. And then after that, other members of the collection staff were serving the film collection sort of as they were able to, in the midst of everything else they were trying to serve up. But given kind of how specific this collection is in terms of the equipment that it requires to view it, the expertise you need to have in order to kind of, you know, deal with it, obviously that was somewhat, the access to the collection was somewhat limited. So then the idea of creating a position kind of came about with the idea that, you know, this is actually, I think the film collection is probably our largest 20th century collection that we have. And obviously things are, you know, researchers are moving forward in time. I mean, and you know, we're 100 years away from our earliest film already. So clearly people are starting to look at this material, and the Historical Society decided it wanted to get somebody to, you know, be a full-time person to open up access to those collections. The bulk of our collections are built around local news film from Providence. So, and that was really what actually kicked off the collection to begin with. So our largest collection is WPRI, which is Channel 12 in Providence. That's the CBS News affiliate in Providence. That was actually the first collection. That was kind of the genesis of the film archive. Was when there was in 1969, there was somebody who was working over at the station. I'm not quite sure what the initial kind of contact was, who came to whom, but basically it was determined even back then that the news station didn't really have the capacity to archive that film long term, and that they needed it to go, you know, to an outside cultural heritage organization who could archive it, preserve it, and make it accessible. And as far as local news film collections are concerned, the overwhelming majority of comparable film elsewhere in the country has been thrown away. So we have in Rhode Island, so we have the WPRI collection, which is our largest. We also have WJAR, which is Channel 10 in Providence. We have a little bit of WTEV, which is now WLNE, the ABC affiliate here. And we also have a lot of film from WSBE, which is Rhode Island PBS. So the fact that we have collections from multiple stations and really spanning for most of the filmed period in television, which, I mean, really these stations started kind of, this type of local station and local news started in the late 1940s. We have film from WJR starting from 1952, and, you know, really pretty consistent up through kind of 1970, between 1979 and 1981 is when things start petering out. That's when news stations switch from shooting in 16mm film to shooting in videotape. So we really do have a pretty extensive comprehensive collection of the filmed local news period. And like in 1997, the Library of Congress had done a big study of local news collections within cultural heritage organizations and found that only about 10% of those collections survived. So it's pretty exceptional that we have this collection that we have. And what the material is, it's not the news as it was broadcast, right? Because basically what we have are the film or the libraries of those television stations. And they were saving things not with any thought in mind about future public access. They were only saving things that they thought could be useful to themselves in the future. So there was no point.
Like file photos or something like that.
Exactly, right. There would have been no thought for them of why you would keep an air check, right? An air check is a recording of what actually was broadcast, because to them, it would have no value in the future. And honestly, that was even the case with the national news networks, who did not all consistently start recording their own air checks until the 1970s. So even like this was just not, television was not considered, even television news was not considered something that was sort of worthy of preservation, by either the content creators or, quite truthfully, even outside organizations. I mean, if you look at kind of the history of film preservation, it was originally all built around the idea of preserving cinema. Television was always kind of considered this lesser, this sort of lower
Right.
form. But then if we think about something like, no library would ever consider not archiving the daily newspaper, right? And the daily news is effectively the same type of thing, except it was just never considered something that people needed, should be archiving. And obviously it's much more complicated, right? It takes up a lot more space. It requires equipment, all of that kind of stuff. So what we have are, it varies a little bit depending on the collection and depending on the time period, but most of what we have is the film that went into making, say, the 30-second or 2-minute story that was part of the news broadcast. So we don't have the anchor saying, now we're going to hear about, commencement at Providence College, but we do have footage of the commencement itself, and maybe there is a quick 10-second clip from the valedictorian speaking because they did what's called a sound up on the news, and you heard that kind of moment, so it kind of varies a little bit what we have. And sometimes we also have material that were longer format, kind of more in-depth type of reports that the news stations would have done, whether that was on things like urban renewal in the 1960s, in Providence, relocation related to the Lippet Hill community, which is sort of what is now like the kind of North Main Street Whole Foods area. So stuff around, displacement of Black communities in Providence, that kind of, we have some more in-depth stuff on that. So it varies. I mean, the collection is really varied. Sorry, I'm just going on and completely rambling. If you have questions, if this is what you want to hear, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I follow-up questions about, maybe like as far as like what the stations were saving. I mean, I guess, like, do you think part of the reason they might not have had as like much priority as compared to like a newspaper or something is because of, you talked about like the physical aspects of the collection. Mm-hmm. So like how much are you fitting on, like a big reel of film? Like half an hour?
Yeah, so 1,000 feet of film, which is, so we're talking about 16 millimeter film, which is smaller than 35 millimeter, which is good. So it's smaller to store. And so the way that the collections, WPRI and WJR, saved things differently. So, and different news stations around the country, this kind of follows suit. WJR, what they would do is they would take each one of those individual 30-second or 2-minute stories or whatever it was, and they would basically just wind it around itself. I don't know if my background is screwing me up, into like a little donut, basically. Right. And they would put a sticker on it that said the date and the title, you know, the slug, what's known as a slug in news, which basically is, you know, it would just say PC commencement, right? That's maybe, or maybe it would say graduation. It would hopefully say PC graduation. You never really know, right, what it was going to say. And that's how they stored things. So they were kind of, you know, I mean, I don't know like the linear feet of what it is as far as we have. I'm trying to think if I could like describe it to you, but you know, one archival box might contain 300 of those little stories. And to tell you the truth, I don't know how many of those boxes we have. But on the other hand, then WPRI, what they would do is they would take those individual stories and they would splice or tape them together from a day. So a day of film might wind up being, you know, 400 feet, which is maybe, sorry, I'm terrible because I have like calculators, you know, film calculators on my computer, so I never know numbers in my head. I'm going to look up what 400 feet is. I absolutely should know this. Let's just see. Okay, so 400 feet is more or less 12 minutes. So, you know, as time went on, oftentimes we'll have 2 of those 400-foot rolls for a day. What the second one usually not as big as the first. So, you know, maybe you have between 10 and 20 minutes worth of film for each day through, say, the 1970s. I would say in the 1960s, they were keeping a lot less, or it didn't make it to us. I'm not really sure. But then there's, you know, huge amounts of outtakes. I mean, that, you know, the stuff that was shot that didn't get edited into a piece for the news. And my understanding is most of that stuff was junked. We seem to have some outtakes for the late 1970s. But mind you, like, we don't have a record. We don't know anything about what's on these reels. Like, I have dates. That's kind of it. And for those outtakes, like, sometimes, honestly, I don't even really have dates. So, yeah, the volume is massive. The ability to organize this stuff, you know, for the station just wasn't a priority. And,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you talked about, you know, you seem like the first like full-time person who's really doing this at the Historical Society, right? Yeah. So you mentioned that you have maybe like more like specific technical skills or experience in this area than maybe some of the other archivists who've worked with the collection before. Do you want to talk about that some?
Yeah. So my background is actually that I worked in documentary film for close to 20 years. I worked doing lots of different things as a producer, but kind of in the end, I basically settled into being exclusively an archival producer, which means I was the person who was finding all of the footage, photographs, documents, whatever kind of material it was that would go into the films and film series. And my specific focus was generally in African-American kind of history and culture documentaries. Primarily stuff for PBS. So my work was basically going to places like the Rhode Island Historical Society and other archives, news, you know, oftentimes news type of collections to try to find material. And, you know, and more or less what you find when you're a researcher is like you oftentimes have trouble being able to get access to what you want to get access to, and that it's not saved. And you're sort of constantly finding that, as you might imagine, certain communities were not documented, many voices are missing from the conversation. I did work on a documentary specifically about Black women entertainer activists, right? It's like nobody in the 1960s was going and asking Black women what they thought about things. So sort of in the midst of all of this work in documentary, I kind of eventually came to realize that I cared more about the archival stuff itself than what we were doing with it in the films. And that kind of working for so many years as a researcher, I then had a kind of specific perspective on what it would mean to be an archivist on the other side, trying to grant greater access, and also thinking about curating collections, based around these ideas of what communities and what voices are traditionally missing. So I decided to go back to graduate school. So I went to NYU, has a program in moving image archiving and preservation. And that's the program that I went to. So that's a 2-year graduate program that is, sort of part library school, or it has library school-esque components to it, but it's a really very focused technical program when it comes to film preservation, video preservation, born digital, audiovisual, complex media, dealing with, we also kind of cover what's known in the museum world as time-based media. So any kind of art piece that has a duration to it. So my training is very technical, kind of in terms of how to manage those kinds of assets, both analog and digital, and getting analog to digital, and then, pieces related to collection management and metadata and, all of that kind of stuff. So that's the skill set that I bring to the Historical Society in dealing with this stuff. And a lot of it has to do with, also the kind of understanding the kind of equipment that we need. I've built up a lot of equipment in the 1.5 years that I've been there, so that we can get greater access to this material. And that's equipment both to watch film and to watch videotape. And, then thinking kind of from a collecting standpoint, I'm really focused. To date in my time there, I've mostly been trying to just get a handle on the materials that we already have in-house, but thinking about what we collect going forward, I'm focused on starting to build relationships with communities in and around Rhode Island who maybe have, have not been represented by collections like the Historical Society before, thinking about going into collaborative relationships with some of those organizations where maybe they have materials, that they need kind of an institution to do some of the preservation work, but obviously without this kind of the more sort of traditional model, which was, institutions going out and sort of taking things from communities, right? And then sort of being like
pillaging.
Right, like we have these things now, as opposed to, talking to communities and saying, like, how can our institution serve you? What do you want in this collection? And what do you want to contribute? And how can we collaborate? And, and all of that. And I think, particularly in the moving image space, that's focused a lot on things like home movies, where, if traditionally you think about, media makers, people who are capturing this kind of film or video or whatever, people, in power who have a certain lens, who maybe are either not interested in, say, communities of color, or are imposing their own perspective on them. What home movies do is obviously give people the ability to document themselves and to present themselves in the manner through their own lens, right? Which is what, we're trying to get more of that sort of content into the Historical Society. So that's kind of going to be one of my bigger kind of collecting initiatives, is around home movies as a way to make sure that we're getting kind of a wider documentation of Rhode Island. And that comes with its own complications, right? I mean, particularly back in the day, it required a certain amount of financial security to have the means, and whether it was a Super 8 camera or 16 millimeter or whatever, or camcorder, whatever it was. But oftentimes, at least, there was maybe somebody within a community who was doing that documentation. And now that we move into a born digital world where people can shoot video with their cell phones and everything, there's more of a democratization there. So we'll be looking at that going forward.
Yeah, so very interesting. So do you want to talk a little bit more about kind of like your educational path? Like, did you do internship or while you were at NYU, or like how long did it take to get like from that program to where you are now?
Yeah. So I mean, I will say that so the NYU program, which has been around for I think about 15 years. There are very few, I'll start by saying there are very few programs like this in the country, and and even quite truthfully internationally. So NYU's has been around for about 15 years. And my cohort was 8 students my year. There tend to be, it averages about 10, I think. I was definitely a different type of student in my cohort, in that this was like a career transition for me. I was much older than most of my classmates. I already had a lot of work experience that was, somewhat adjacent to this. So my path, I will say, was like a little bit different than some other people's. But the program itself, which is really rigorous, and hard to keep working while you're doing it, it's really sort of not encouraged. In some ways, I would try to take consulting jobs when I could. But within the program, you do 3 internships. So you do in the spring of your first year, you do an internship in New York. That's a 210 hours. 210 hours. Then the summer between your first and second year, you do 10-week full-time internship. That's 350 hours. And then you do another 210 in the fall of your second year. So for my 3 internships, my first one, I was in the archive of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts organization, which had a very large 35 millimeter film collection that nobody had kind of looked at ever, I would say. And the archivist there, was a paper archivist, had no kind of experience with moving image stuff. So that was me very much. So the thing about the internships through the MEAP program is sometimes you're going into a situation where you have like a real mentor supervisor who's going to teach you a whole bunch of stuff. And sometimes you're going into an organization where you are going to be the expert sort of right off of the bat, and you're going to be, acting as almost more of a consultant to them. I had two of the latter and one of the former. So my first one at Lincoln Center was very much like me coming in and even just like building, getting some film equipment and building a film inspection bench so we could even start looking at that collection and kind of inform and, organizing it and things like that. And after I was there, the archivist was able to hire some other people and have some other people to come in and do some more work with that collection. For my summer internship, I was out in California, splitting my time between the Bancroft Library, which is the Berkeley University Special Collections Library, and a project called the California Audiovisual Preservation Project, which has since become something called California Revealed, which is kind of a statewide initiative to digitize any archival material pertaining to California. And it started as being only AV stuff, and now it's expanded to include other media. And at Berkeley, you know, it was much like it had been at Lincoln Center, which is that they did not have an AV person on staff. Even within the Berkeley Special Collections Conservation Department, there was nobody there who was an AV specialist. Quite truthfully, they knew very little about their collections. And that was, again, me acting a lot as kind of a consultant, putting in place new metadata standards, more, you know, sort of new ways of them kind of understanding, like, here are the points of information that you need to be able to preserve your collections. And doing some trainings for staff there and creating some new kind of intake forms. Okay, when a collection comes in, you know, here's what you need to record about it, things like that. And then my last internship was at the CUNY City University of New York TV archive. And that was like a completely different situation, where the person who's the head of that archive is this like complete guru within the moving image archiving community, who is one of the people building a lot of open source tools that the AV archiving community uses. So with him, I was learning coding, you know, some stuff related to kind of coding and video digitization. I kind of did work to clean up their video digitization rack there. So that was more of a situation where I had more kind of guidance, I would say, in that situation. And I graduated, I finished the program in May of 2018, and I got this job in Rhode Island, I guess was offered to me in, you know, that summer, and I started here in September. So I basically went from the program straight into this position. But again, I think that would not necessarily have been the trajectory for all of my classmates. And, you know, some of this has to do with, or a lot of it probably has to do with what my previous work experience was as well.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, so do you want to tell me about some of the challenges either in your current position or during, you know, those internships? Like there was, we've talked about it in class, like, you know, sometimes there's like tension between like public historians and academics, or like the public, or like the people seeking it, or just any challenges that you experience a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I will say in my internships, I had virtually no contact with the public, I would say, or with researchers, right? I was really, in all of them, I was really kind of working behind the scenes to just get, you know, it was much more kind of collection management type of stuff that I was doing. You know, and I would say that the things that could be challenging about that, I think, is having institutions kind of understand just how complex their audiovisual collections are, and kind of what it means to understand them, what it means to provide access to them. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of MPLP, more product, less process. Is that familiar to you? So that's kind of, it's an idea in archives. I mean, I want to say it's about 15 years old, maybe, I'm not quite sure. But basically, you know, MPLP, the idea is, yes, we would all love to make a perfect catalog record. And best practice tells us that, you know, it would be great if we could do item level cataloging on this, and we know all these metadata points and all of that kind of stuff. Except realistically, everybody has insane backlogs. And basically what MPLP says is, you know what, even if all you can do is get a single collection record up that can tell your researchers, hey, we have this thing. It's a lot better to say, hey, we have this thing, than, you know, never letting people even know that you have that thing because you were waiting to get it item level cataloged.
Right.
And, you know, and also the thinking, right, that what researchers are interested in obviously evolves over time, and patterns change in research, and you know, you may have made collection plans, you know, cataloging plans at one point in time saying these are our most important collections, we need to get these things cataloged. Whereas, you know, if it takes you 20 years to work through that backlog, 20 years later, people's needs are very different. So get any evidence up that you have those things, and then researchers will come and they'll explain to you essentially what's most important, right? Because they'll be like, oh, this is the thing that I want to look at. And then if you realize that a lot of people are looking at that thing, you're like, oh, well, maybe it makes sense to bump this up in priority. So MPLP, which is something that I believe deeply, deeply in, is a really complicated thing when it comes to AV. Because sometimes with AV, particularly when you're talking about risk factors related to videotape, let's say, you know, you might be able to stick paper in a box on a shelf for 100 years and it'll be okay. And you can even quite truthfully stick film in a box on a shelf for 100 years. And as long as it's relatively cool and dry, that film is probably going to persist. If you stick a videotape on a shelf for 30 years, the magnetic particles might shed off of it. None of the equipment that you need to read that videotape has been manufactured in decades as it is anyway. You know, so like it's known as the magnetic media crisis, basically. So what can be difficult, I mean, this was something that I feel like I was dealing with at Berkeley that was interesting. The UC California system has kind of an overarching MPLP sort of mandate that they've taken on. But if you say, you know, an MPLP would sort of tell you to write down, I have a box of videotapes, right? But a box of videotapes could be a box of VHS tapes, or it could be a box of, you know, 2-inch open reel quad, of which there's only, you know, probably less than 100 machines in the country that can even play that anymore, you know? So there's I think that's one of the things that's kind of tricky. I find tricky, quite truthfully, myself, as I'm sort of going through, you know, dealing with these kinds of materials, is sort of balancing the kind of how much you need to record about information versus just like getting it kind of out into the world. And I think the biggest misconception, quite truthfully, within organizations is the notion of digitization as preservation, and what digitization entails, and what digital preservation entails. I mean, digital preservation in many ways is much more complex and much more at risk than analog preservation in a lot of cases. Videotape not being the case. But if you think about something like film, you know, like I said, if you leave it in a cool, dry place, it's kind of okay, you know, it's basically okay. And you can pick up a piece of film, and if you shine light through it, you can see an image. Whereas when you're talking about ones and zeros on a hard drive, you're dealing with, you know, not only are you dealing with the possibility of that, you know, obviously that hard drive failing, and those bits flipping and that file no longer becoming readable, but also, like, you know, was that video created in a format that your current operating system can read? Is it in something proprietary? Is it, you know, does that drive have to attach to a computer through a cable that, you know, nobody really uses anymore? You know, all of these kind of levels of digital preservation. And I think that people, you know, a lot of institutions have this kind of, you know, everybody was like, this is amazing, digitization is going to save us and we're going to make everything accessible. And it's like, well, if you go and you just digitize a whole pile of stuff, now you have, you know, you may have previously had an analog mess, well, now you have a digital mess, right? I mean, it's and so it's still all of the kind of cataloging and everything that goes along with making those digital things accessible. And then it's also kind of understanding what the digital preservation side of that is. You know, and I think when people start thinking about grants, I mean, I think funders have now gotten hip to this, but it used to be, you know, people would just be like, oh, I'll go get money to digitize something. And people would get funds to digitize something, and then they would come back and they would have a few hard drives sitting on a shelf somewhere. And it's like, well, did you think about, you know, what you need to preserve the content on those hard drives in perpetuity, and every 5 years be migrating that data onto new hardware and, you know, reformatting the files themselves so that they may have at one point they were in QuickTime, but really, well, Apple doesn't support QuickTime in the same way anymore, so now it needs to be in an MP4 file, you know, all of these different kinds of things. So I think that is one of the biggest kind of challenges, I think, in managing these sorts of collections is kind of on the digital preservation side, and kind of, you know, the funding that it takes to do that. And, you know, again, like if you're an organization, you may be able to scan a photograph yourself, but in order to really digitize a film, for the most part, that's going out to an external lab that needs to be paid, right? So there's just all of these kind of, I think these materials, you know, are more complicated, and quite truthfully, just more expensive generally to kind of preserve. And then, you know, when we're talking about digital preservation, you know, video files are massive. I mean, absolutely massive compared to, you know, the TIFF that you might have if you scan a photograph or something. So I think that's kind of just one of the bigger challenges sort of in this AV space is funding and, you know, and all of that.
Right.
Getting into budgets.
With regards to those challenges and like providing access to researchers and stuff, I mean, one of the things that her name is slipping my mind, but the new archivist at PC is from, I think Michelle. She used to work at, right, yeah, Michelle Charles, yeah. So she was talking about, you know, she's had people reach out to her about like these old basketball game tapes they have that are from local TV and stuff, and you know, she has concerns, like some of them are, you know, digitized onto like DVDs and stuff, but she was like, if they're not, you know, I have concerns about like putting the, you know, I can't just put the film on a projector or whatever because it could rip or tear or catch on fire or whatever. So like, as far as like providing access to, you know, like people who want to see your stuff, how do you go about that? Or like, what are you thinking about?
So, I mean, Michelle even brought some of the films from PC over to look at with me on my equipment. So the main thing that I use to look at film, so depending on the age and the condition of the film, so you would never put archival film really on a projector. A projector is just a particularly, I mean, some projectors better than others, but it's a pretty grabby device, if that makes sense. There's a lot of movement, and there's basically a claw that comes out and kind of grabs each one of those holes along the side of the film, and it's pulling it along. So it's a projector, kind of, you don't want to put film in a projector. One of the first pieces of equipment that I got at the Historical Society is something called a flatbed editor. And I can send you photos of stuff if you're interested to sort of see what I'm talking about. And what that is it's what people used to use to edit, you know, when people used to edit on film, they used, you know, a flatbed editor was one of the ways they would do it.
Right, it's got like the little screen and like the
Yep,
reels.
exactly. It's a much gentler way of looking at your film. So I have one of those at the Historical Society now. It's from 1981. And that is the primary way that I look at the collection now. The collection that's in good enough shape for me to look at it there. And the main thing, one of the main things that happens to film as it deteriorates, as it gets old, is that it shrinks. So the space between those sprocket holes gets smaller. So if a film has shrunken too much, you can't put it on anything that's going to engage with those sprocket holes because it's going to tear it. So fortunately, our film collection is in relatively good shape, and most of it, absolutely no problem. I can run it through that Steenbeck, and that's how I look at things. So when a researcher wants to see film, and the first step for us is that I have to prepare films in order to be viewable on that Steenbeck to begin with. And that means going through a process often of repairing film, particularly for that WJR collection where the films are just tightly wound onto themselves in these little donuts. Basically what I have to do is I need to clean the 50-year-old adhesive goo that's holding that together, put on some film leader on the front and on the back of it, move it onto what's called a film core, which is about 3 inches wide, and the film kind of goes around it. Once I get it onto that, then I'm able to put it down onto my flatbed viewer, and then we can watch the film. And that flatbed viewer also will play the sound for the film. So when I have local researchers, like they request film from me, sometimes some of our collections, WJR collection is in our online catalog and you can search it. WPRI is not. So generally with researchers, I kind of tell them, like, have a conversation with me about what your topic is. And oftentimes I can find more stuff than, what they can find online. So people request film, we take some time for me to prep it. Then I have people, which could be, depends on how busy I am, a week or less or whatever. People who are local come in and they basically just come and sit next to me and we watch the film on that flatbed viewer together. And then if, it's something that somebody, say, wants to use in a documentary or in a performance or something like that, it would get sent out to a lab for digitization. Or the other thing that I can do in-house, and this is what I do for my non-local patrons, is I will just set up a tripod with kind of a crappy digital point and shoot, and I just shoot a reference video off of the screen. And in the case of the sound, you can hear the clicking of the machine in the background, and it's not ideal, but it's a reference copy. And, I share those with people via Google Drive, and depending on somebody's work, that might be all they need, right? They may or may not need a kind of pristine copy of it, or they might just be looking at it for reference purposes. So that's how I primarily provide access to the collection. In some cases, when when the film is too brittle or too deteriorated to go up on the flatbed, then you just put it up on a rewind bench, which is really just a couple of cranks, and you look at the film, you put a light box under it, and you can look at the film through a loop magnifier, and you figure out if it's what you need, and then that can be sent out to a lab. And film scanners now work where they don't have anything physical that touches that sprocket hole. They're basically reading it. They're essentially just shining a light through, and when they get through the film, because they know they hit a hole, then the scanner is essentially knowing, like, oh, I've hit a frame line, and it's able to scan things that way. So we can now, fortunately, scan film very gently. So even extremely deteriorated film, a lot of it is now, you're able to kind of digitize it in a way that we didn't used to be able to. And I basically said to people like Michelle, and quite truthfully other collections around the state, like, hey, I have this equipment. If you need to come look at things with me, come look at it, bring your stuff. And I I see us as being somewhat of a resource for the state as far as equipment is concerned.
Yeah, so that's something you mentioned at when you were at the Bancroft too, with like you were collecting a lot of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
So how does like funding concerns and stuff like that come into question with that? Because I would imagine a lot of this equipment is probably not cheap or hard to find or
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah, it varies. I mean, fortunately, in the case of the Historical Society, when they created this permanent position for an AV archivist, they fortunately put aside a pot of money for equipment, knowing that somebody would need to kind of get things up and running. So I was really lucky with the Historical Society that I was able to say, like, okay, we need this equipment in order to make this accessible. You know, and I'm sort of slowly building up other stuff. I mean, I just shortly before the pandemic, I had actually an old U-matic videotape deck. U-matic was the first video cassette format that came around in the 1970s. So I had actually taken a U-matic deck when I was leaving Lincoln Center. There was a production office there that had a bunch of them that they were getting rid of. I took one of those. I thing weighed at least 60 pounds. I hoofed it up to my fourth floor walk-up apartment in Brooklyn. It was just like, I am keeping this piece of equipment. And I have now brought that piece of equipment to the Historical Society. It was actually just repaired for me by a guy in Massachusetts. And all of this was kind of negotiated by, there's a place called the Museum of Broadcast Technology in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, actually. These great old broadcast engineers that I've hooked up with who have all of this equipment, who kind of now look after me. So they helped to get my decks over to this guy in Natick, Massachusetts to repair them. And they just gave me 2 new monitors and a time-based corrector. And, so honestly, a lot of it kind of happens in a bit of a, it's very communal. One of the biggest fears actually in the field has to do with the obsolescence of the technology and our ability to get our hands on it, but B, equally important is the people who know how to keep it operating. Most of the people, I mean, my flatbed, which came from New York, a guy who had been servicing Steenbeck's, the kind of flatbed that I have in, for decades, reconditions them. He took the thing apart, packed it into the back of his sedan, drove it to Rhode Island, put it together for me. When I'm having a problem with it, I'll FaceTime him and hold my camera over a part of it and show him. And sometimes he's like, quiet, let me hear what sound it's making, and then he talks me through, that I'm changing fuses and taking the leg apart and, trying to troubleshoot things and make adjustments and tensions. And, and that's Paul. Paul's in his 70s. There's another guy in the Cape who's in his 70s who works on these Steenbecks. Those are the only 2 guys I know of on the East Coast who do it. In the video world, we're up against a pretty similar kind of situation where it's a lot of, older male engineers. And, to be gendered for a second, men tend to not always be as good at women as, say, passing on knowledge. There's a lot of, they'll just sort of do it. So I think a lot of us younger people in the field are trying to really get, some of this kind of repair and technology knowledge out of them in kind of apprentice type of situations or recording oral histories with them and all of that. But I mean, the equipment is, it's tricky. And I mean, that there really is a finite amount of it. And there are a lot of, really large labs who are doing mass digitization projects for oftentimes universities and things, and those companies are trolling eBay and buying up, everything, sometimes just for spare parts to keep their own stuff running. But it means when you're a smaller organization like ours and you're trying to get your hands on a good deck, you know, it can be really tricky to get equipment and get equipment that's in good working order, you know, that's been, and then, you know, how long in the future will we be able to service this stuff? So it's a very large concern in the field.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing we've heard a lot of people is kind of like these professional and like personal resources, or people you're dealing with it, which sounds like, you know, again, like a big part of that. Are there other like resources that are really important to you, or like connections you have with other professionals, or like do you go to conferences or anything like that?
So the main professional organization is called the Association of Moving Image Archivists. It's an international organization, much more heavily focused, I would say, in the U.S., but definitely has, you know, an international contingent as well. There's an annual conference that happens every November. That's definitely kind of where the field looks, I would say, is to EMEA, from the perspective of information, but also community. There's a lot of kind of open source tool building that kind of that comes out of that community, and some of that is actually, interestingly, more international. There's some big projects, kind of open source, like video digitization projects and different stuff that happens on a pretty international scale, actually. So that's really that's the go-to for the field. And this summer, this is something where my next Zoom meeting of the day is about this. So this summer was supposed to be the launch of a pilot program through EMEA for a fellowship program, a diversity and inclusion fellowship, to try to get more people from kind of underrepresented communities into the field. So there's going to be 4 of those EMEA fellows, and then there are host sites around the country that'll be providing internships. So the Historical Society is one of those host sites. So the organization is also, you know, does a lot of active kind of mentoring of up-and-coming professionals and students. There are EMEA student chapters within a lot of library schools and different programs. Yeah, as for this summer internship, it's now we're all like, who knows what's happening? But the organization is definitely, you know, very supportive of its younger professionals. My understanding from kind of what I've heard is that, you know, I think it used to be more of a kind of older techie group, or kind of like the main people who were the loudest voices, I would say, were often, you know, like these kind of male broadcast engineer types. And I think the organization is now changing to become a more kind of open and inclusive type of place. I mean, there's a listserv, a very active listserv that, you know, back in the day, you know, people were afraid to ask technical questions because it was almost as though you would get your head bitten off for not knowing, you know, something already. And I think it's now become like a more open, kind of inviting place. Definitely an organization that cares a lot more now, I think, about just getting better representation in the field. I mean, I've been at the EMEA conference the past 3 or 4 years, I would say. And the year before me, apparently there was like a whole thing where they were like, yes, we're addressing diversity. And it turns out that diversity meant like you should care about both the film and the video collections, like not diversity of the people. So that kind of tells you a little bit about what, you know, the way that the field is moving. I think there is a lot more kind of understanding now of, you know, archives are not neutral, and understanding what, you know, what it means that we have these materials, and what we don't have, and all of that.
Right. So, just one more question.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for students, people like in my position or similar positions, about, if they have interest in public history more generally, or, your area specifically?
I mean, audiovisual preservation specifically, which is really, I will say, like, I don't really have much experience outside of my little world of this, because this is kind of the only, this is the only job that I've had so far in the field, and my background being documentary. I think it's really, I think it's kind of brutal, although seemingly getting a little better, in the way that the internship kind of, the internship system has grown up, which is that, if you want to get a job, you need to get an internship to get experience, and those internships were so frequently not paid. I do think the field, both EMEA as well as certainly Society of American Archivists and a lot of other organizations now, will no longer post positions for unpaid internships. I think the community is really turning towards the understanding that, we cannot be not paying people to train to enter this field, because obviously that only permits certain people to get into it, based on people's personal economic situations. So, in my NYU program, every single one of those internships that I had in school was stipended and quite well paid, quite truthfully. And this summer, my intern, should I be able to get that person, because of COVID, my internship will be paid. But that is something that we are only, I think, very slowly starting to make some changes on. I think it's, particularly when you're talking about something like AV, right, where you have to kind of get this hands-on experience with it, you have to get into archives. And yeah, the kind of financial ability to do that is really tricky. So, there can be some ways to sort of volunteer and get a little bit of, proximity to things. We have an event, a lot of places around the country and around the world have an annual event called Home Movie Day. And Home Movie Day is the type of thing where I feel like you could volunteer, people could volunteer to be part of Home Movie Day, which will get you, kind of tap you into your community's group of AV archivist types. And, I think joining the EMEA listserv is something to just, if you want to sort of learn more about the field and about what the conversation is, I think checking out the EMEA website, and looking and joining the EMEA listserv is kind of an interesting way to just get a little sense of what the field is, because it is kind of different than other parts of, I think, of the library and archive world.
So one thing that seemed kind of different about your experiences compared to the other archivists who have all been, primarily like paper material. Like we met with Geraldine at the John Brown House.
Yep.
And stuff like that. So they talked a lot about, her and Michelle talked about kind of like the saturation, especially in New England, of like public historians and like, people who have done library science programs and stuff like that. But it sounds like, at least from your internship experiences, that as long as there's funding, I guess, there's a lot of space kind of for AV archivists in maybe a way there isn't for other, like, more traditional styles.
Yeah. I think it's improving, in the sense that I think what's going on right now, particularly within academic libraries is that people are realizing more and more that they have this material, that it's not going to last forever, particularly the magnetic stuff, right? The videotape and the audio tape. And that you just can't do this work with your existing staff. It's just too different and too, too time consuming, quite truthfully. So I think there is a bit of a growing space, particularly within academic libraries, I think, for people looking for this kind of training. And then the other thing is and I would say this has to do with a lot, like, for example, there's another program in the country, the Selznick School, which is at the University of Rochester, which is much more of a program focused in film preservation and film, real kind of film restoration, as opposed to getting into some of the video and some of the born digital stuff. I think the other really smart space to go into that kind of ties to the AV is the digital side. Because also all kinds of companies now, right? Everybody is creating video, and all of those people are going to need to preserve that video. So, and sometimes that falls under the category, your title might not be archivist, it might be digital asset manager, let's say. And a lot of the time, quite truthfully, if your title can be digital asset manager or something with the word digital in it, you'll get paid a hell of a lot better than if your title is archivist or curator. Because sort of organizations sort of lump you in more with like the IT side of things. And they think of you as having
more essential,
this kind of this sort of technical training in a different kind of way. And so I do think that, that side of it, I think, is actually going to open up more to people. But that's a really, different type of job, right? That's a really technical job. And that's, the best thing you can do in that space is you can learn Python, and, become a coder and, in some ways. Whereas one of the things that I particularly love about my position is that it's a huge mix of all of those things. So it's like, sometimes I'm, completely just spending my day with Q-tips and razor blades and film. Other days I'm, writing protocols around, different kinds of technical metadata related to my video files. My digital video files. Sometimes I'm working with, electromagnetic video decks that I need to be tinkering with. And then sometimes it's, much more of a public historian role where I'm doing, I did a program a couple months ago with the Rhode Island Council of the Humanities, where we put on a screening program of material that kind of dealt with immigration in both of our collections. And that's a very different kind of thing. And I work with our education department. I work with Geraldine to get her video that complements online curriculum stuff that they're, lesson plans that they're putting together for the work that they're doing. So my role is really kind of all over the place, which I really like. And quite truthfully, I wouldn't be happy if I had one of those digital asset manager jobs, although I would love if the Historical Society would hire a digital archivist. Like, that would be, that would be my dream, is if I have that person as a colleague, quite truthfully. So I do think kind of getting those technical skills is really valuable. And I also don't necessarily think, more and more, I'm not sure you necessarily have to go to a program like mine to get them. I think more library science programs are now, getting more technical and getting better at kind of digital preservation type of training. So there's still some, particularly within the academic sphere, there are definitely still some institutions that really want everybody who works in their academic library to have a information library science degree. People in my field, particularly like the founder of my program, this guy Howard Besser, who's been around forever, like Howard has like single-handedly tried to push a lot of institutions around the country to basically relax on that and say MLIS or equivalent training, with the idea that like if what you really need is an AV archivist, you don't necessarily need, you're going to be better off hiring somebody like me who's got that technical training coming out of a program like NYU's MEAP, as opposed to somebody coming out of a traditional library science, field or degree program. So, but I think that, if I had to advise somebody today whether to go to my program or to go to a library science program and try really hard to get a good internship within an institution, say like mine, where I can really put somebody to work in a lot of different formats and something like that, I would maybe lean them towards library school. It's a more, it's just a more transportable, kind of skill. But you're not going to come out of library school and get the job that I got. So,
right.
If you 100% know that you want to be in the AV space, I still think it could make sense to go to a program like mine. But yeah, I would say, it's the tech side of things. I mean, quite truthfully, in the documentary field, like, we would always joke as producers, it's like, why the hell are we producers? We have to raise money, pay everybody before we pay ourselves. We pay our editors twice as much as we pay ourselves. We pay our camera people twice as much as we pay ourselves. Like, in some ways, like when you can get that sort of the more technical kind of side of things, that can be really useful. But that is not what somebody going into a public history program is doing. That's that's more when you're kind of thinking about the library archive side of it, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess I may have lied. Maybe one more question. You
No,
talked
no
about
worries.
this, I guess, somewhat, especially when you were talking about like your old role as a producer. But
Yeah.
one of the things that has also been kind of a constant is a lot of the institutions that we've spoken to have been, kind of pushing for like more inclusive storytelling. Like the John Brown House is, like big on like including the slavery, aspects and like things that may be like more uncomfortable or stuff like that.
Yep.
Has that been something you've experienced, I guess, in your current role, or something that you're advocating for, or
Yeah,
how
it's
do you
something.
that?
Yeah. It is something that I am pushing quite hard for in my current role. Something that I also made clear sort of during the interview process for my job. I made it quite clear that that was a real priority of mine. That would be a lot of the focus of kind of my, my programming and my collecting initiatives and things like that. So yeah, and I think that's, I think can be tough, it can be tough in old organizations. I mean, I think, a collection like ours, like the Historical Society is, in many ways the Historical Society has been a largely passive collecting institution for a lot of its life. And, we are so kind of minimal in staff with so much stuff to care for that all we can really do is just try to like keep caring for the stuff we have, make more of it accessible, make more of it, serve it up to the public, get it online, do all of that kind of stuff, right? So then when it comes to collecting, a lot of the time, really, the stuff that we're collecting is the stuff that people mail to us. It's the stuff that, not that we accept everything that people mail to us, but, a lot of it is really, somebody's grandparent dies or whomever, and they're cleaning out the attic and they come across this stuff and they say, you know, I have these really old letters and my family, you know, was this important big family in Rhode Island, and, you know, I think this stuff should go to the Historical Society. You know, and when you do that, when you're sort of in this passive collecting stance, you wind up essentially getting more of oftentimes what you already have, because the people who know what you have are the people whose families gave it before, or its communities gave it before, or whatever, you know. So you get, you know, if you think your stuff belongs in the Rhode Island Historical Society, it's because you have a certain opinion about your family and your community and how important your stuff is, right? So if you come from a community that has had no relationship with the Rhode Island Historical Society before, either because your community only arrived here in the 1970s, let's say, or 1980s, or, you know, has not been programmed to by us, or, you know, whatever it is, obviously you're not going to find old stuff in the attic and be like, you know what, I should give this to the Rhode Island Historical Society. So I think that, you know, turning from kind of passive collecting to more active collecting, more intentional collecting, and collecting that happens much more in collaboration, is something that I think, you know, we're trying to do, and I'm definitely, you know, very much encouraging us to do. I mean, quite truthfully, like, I'm the only person within the research center who has the title curator in the word curator in my title. Like, we don't even, you know, that's not even really our emphasis. Quite truthfully, our emphasis is on taking care of the things we have and serving them up, as opposed to, you know, curating to bring in new collections. So I think it has to be, you know, it has to be a really intentional move on our part to make that happen. And, you know, and that has to do with both the relationships that we're building and also mentoring people within, you know, the field at large to come into this field, mentoring people in Rhode Island who come from underrepresented groups. I mean, all of that is stuff that I'm, you know, definitely working on really actively. And yeah, trying to kind of keep us moving in the right direction.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much.